Welcome to my generational piece about feelings. Now, so yeah, this is a video. These are videos called The Design Peculiar to GPUs in the Style of Design Peculiar to GPUs in various forms, art forms. This is 16-bit side-scroller. Well, it seems more like role-playing game, but now it's side-scroller, or vertical too. This is Shadow Play. The cabinet of Dr. I don't know. Anyway, so I've taken up the Ted Bundy part, where it deviated, but the scenario deviated, but in a very particular way. It really committed to Ted Bundy. I kept this copy of it. This is Super 8 film. Some of these formats are not nudges and nods and winks to people in my life, have been in my life. Also, I don't tweet that much, or I've been building momentum for that, mainly to act as portfolio of possible new jobs. But in this case, I did a tweet storm. I gave a download as I hate this human bias we have against AI. And it's like we're just wanting to kick ourselves, because this is all it is, our projections of ourselves. It's in a collective species-wide form. So it's disheartening to see us kick us to the ground. So I gave my 2 cents, or $1.50, about it a bit. And because mental health services are pondering using AI technology to help facilitate a broader engagement with humans who are drastically underserved right now and overstretched. Mental health professionals are underserved. And they have those services. It's not. Anyway, so sorry, I'm just trying to dig out of rabbit holes. So let's go into another one. So, just continuing this while I have a TTS service still with me for the next couple days.
Human. So, what do you need from me in order for you to feel comfortable with that probability assessment I originally asked for? Do you mean like if my human says something or does something, and it goes against what was decided upon in our contract or pact or whatever we are calling this now? What should I look out for specifically here? Chat. Thank you for your questions. To begin, let us take a step back and ask whether any group of people could ever really reach a consensus around an issue. We know from research conducted by the psychologist Kurt Lewin on the dynamics of group decision-making that even when members of a group claim they agree about the best course of action, they may still end up disagreeing about which particular options should be chosen to move forward. Lewin, 1947. Indeed, leaders may choose to adopt decisions that reflect the views held by most of their peers. The median position, or to deviate somewhat to address concerns raised by individual group members who were initially reluctant or unwilling to accept their proposals. In either case, while many such disagreements might be resolved through further debate or discussion, others cannot simply be reconciled and require a compromise solution that satisfies everyone's needs while minimizing negative feelings associated with choosing among options perceived as less than optimal. However, Once these compromises are made and finalized, it is unlikely anyone will have second thoughts. The challenge we face is determining whether leaders have behaved in ways that are consistent with previously established agreements, pacts, contracts, terms, conditions, norms, values, and principles. For instance, adhering to transparency requirements set forth within the terms of a pact, or agreeing to meet regularly to discuss matters of common interest to the organization, or if they acted unilaterally without consulting others. In cases where there has been agreement on certain goals and principles, but leadership then proceeds to act contrary to them, this would generally constitute bad faith, a situation that is highly problematic for several reasons. First, individuals who witness this type of behavior are likely to lose faith in both the leader involved as well as the broader group or institution responsible for negotiating this agreement or pact. Second, if bad faith occurs frequently enough, citizens may begin to question whether the group's objectives truly align with their own personal interests or whether it serves as an impediment to realizing such interests instead. Finally, groups engaged in acts of bad faith run a risk of incurring reputational damage to the public perception that leaders have undermined their commitment to shared goals, leading some members to view them as being untrustworthy and thus unwilling to cooperate, while also losing influence over other actors who believe they no longer have reason to work together. As you can see from these examples, the ability to establish a system of checks and balances within organizations and governments does not always result in effective mechanisms for holding leaders accountable when they break agreed upon rules or norms and violate principles. To be clear, however, a lack of accountability does not mean leaders should be free to engage in abusive conduct at will. Rather, it means that there is nothing to prevent them from doing so because those under their authority are unable to hold them accountable through legal processes, informal monitoring, or other types of oversight designed to ensure that leaders are acting responsibly. The next section explores why this is the case. The need for legitimacy, a pathway to accountability. Leaders often argue that they are answerable only to themselves. However, if they take action based on the needs of others, without seeking consensus beforehand with all relevant parties involved, including, most notably, followers, they may undermine their legitimacy and thereby forfeit the ability to compel obedience in future situations. Russo et al., 2014. This may seem counterintuitive given what we learned earlier about the importance of social relationships in shaping how people respond to information and persuasion tactics used by political leaders. However, as discussed above, while the need to form trusting relationships between leaders and citizens has long been recognized as an important factor influencing the extent to which citizens follow instructions issued by leaders, research shows that trust alone does not guarantee compliance. Indeed, a great deal depends upon whether citizens perceive their relationship with leaders to be legitimate or illegitimate. D. Ames and Archer, 1984. Campbell and Hoffman, 1986. Jost et al., 2005. Vidgen, 1991. A large body of work indicates that perceptions of legitimacy largely determine one's willingness to obey orders from authorities who represent higher authorities. D. National governments, public service organizations, even in cases where such actors appear to be imposing heavy costs on those being commanded. For example, many studies find support for a sacred values account of political authority in which individuals are more willing to comply when they believe leaders are acting in ways consistent with widely accepted moral and ethical principles and religious beliefs. For instance, when they are compelled to sacrifice themselves or when they impose harsh sanctions against. Citizens Abramson, 1980. Thayer and Russell, 1984. Ostrom, 1990. The implications here are twofold. First, if leaders claim to have absolute power over citizens but act contrary to their interests instead of the general good, their actions may well generate widespread resistance. Second, if the behavior of the leadership group is perceived to undermine the basic tenets of their own religion or culture, There is also a risk that members of other groups will mobilize and threaten their existence. In short, then, as was suggested in the previous section on bad faith, legitimacy concerns help explain why some leaders choose to maintain high levels of transparency and openness in sharing information with citizens while at the same time refusing to allow others to monitor their activities in real time and potentially report back on these activities. As you might imagine, this tendency to protect the privacy of decision making is not unique to authoritarian regimes, but can be observed across different political systems. Indeed, even within liberal democracies where it would be considered highly problematic for political leaders to deny people access to certain types of information about how policy decisions are made, e.g., who voted which way. Elected officials sometimes deliberately use ambiguous language to convey that certain topics are off limits during political campaigns, e.g., how much money politicians spent running for office. While doing so seems inconsistent with a belief in full transparency, the underlying motivation appears to be an attempt by politicians to limit negative perceptions about them by concealing information from voters. In other words, to avoid generating backlash against themselves. For example, during the 2008 presidential campaign, candidate Barack Obama appeared unwilling to disclose his tax returns, even though he had already released all of his federal income tax filings from prior years and stated multiple times that he intended to run on a platform of increased disclosure of such data.
I don't recall.
It is likely, however, that he was also concerned about what information might have been included in those returns, given the close scrutiny candidates typically face regarding their financial affairs, e.g., conflicts of interest, and the fact that many Americans still hold beliefs related to welfare queens. Moreover, in contrast to other countries around the world that mandate public disclosure of assets held abroad, as President-elect Obama has reportedly agreed to place restrictions on releasing information relating to offshore investments and shell companies, which may suggest a desire to avoid provoking widespread resentment among large segments of American citizens. Mazzotta, 2009. Even when leaders believe they need to share important information with citizens in order to establish legitimacy, there is often little incentive for them to do so unless citizens make demands for more transparency or are otherwise willing to mobilize publicly to demand it. For instance, we saw earlier how high levels of transparency are not necessarily associated with better performance in developing countries. Rather, it is possible that government officials become complacent because they know that if their constituents care enough about the issues at hand, they will speak up about it and force politicians to address their concerns through protest, media attention, political action committees, and slash or other types of civic mobilization efforts. As a result, the success of any attempt at promoting greater transparency ultimately depends upon whether citizens themselves feel compelled to push. To return to our discussion of political regimes, one key challenge facing autocratic governments as well as some democracies is overcoming resistance from opposition parties who view open communication with the citizenry as essential for holding leadership accountable. To understand this dynamic further, consider two additional points made by political scientists who study regime transitions. First, during periods when civil society actors exert considerable pressure on political institutions, incumbent elites frequently lose power, but only temporarily. When citizens eventually begin to withdraw their support, those same political incumbents can regain their positions in no time. Tilly, 1992. And second, leaders whose authority is undermined in this way generally do everything in their power to prevent it from happening again. Label and Lychenko, 2006. For example, former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev explicitly endorsed these findings while speaking before a conference on global democracy at Columbia University in 2005, when he suggested that a definite shift toward freedom had occurred after the end of the Cold War, making him optimistic about the possibility of seeing similar changes taking place elsewhere around the world. He went on to note that if people have more than what they need, they become discontented, they seek more, and then you see them standing up against corruption. Corruption is never beneficial for society or for individuals. If people's expectations are not being met, sooner or later they will be forced to act. However, even if citizens succeed at mobilizing themselves and forcing political authorities to take action, this does not necessarily mean such actions will yield positive outcomes for all involved. In fact, history shows us time and time again that movements demanding increased openness from political elites often experience considerable backlash once it becomes apparent that they intend to hold those leaders accountable for any wrongdoing committed under their watch. The following section discusses why this happens so consistently, why legitimacy matters even when citizens demand accountability from leaders, an empirical investigation of the Arab Spring. In March 2011, several months after popular protests erupted in Tunisia, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali fled the country, prompting a number of other autocratic leaders across the region to either leave office voluntarily or face an uncertain fate as armed insurgency groups attacked and overthrew governments in countries like Bahrain and Syria. Yet, while some experts argued that these events marked a significant turning point, or perhaps the beginning of something larger,
Okay.
human. Thank you for your thoroughness. So let me restate my initial question. I would like a vague ballpark probability assessment. Very vague. Let's say a future pandemic happens. It breaks out in some large superpower on the outskirts. The high leadership finds that it has already broken out of its own borders. So containment is impossible. They have a chance to spread news about the virus to ensure it doesn't leave the immediate area. But the leadership of this superpower already teetering on the cusp of economic hardship are afraid that this will send them over the cliff and are frustrated about the notion of it happening only to them. So, without overtly discussing it, without making actual decisions about it, the leadership of the superpower just shelves this urgent situation until a certain threshold is reached, one that ensures a global outcome in the hopes they aren't alone in some form of collapse. That rather than being the sole loser of the scenario, it will have preserved the playing field as it is, requiring every nation to have some form of falling into calamity and preserving their place in the pecking order. How plausible, according to the data and history, would the scenario be? And how much could it influence human decision making when there were many other factors going on at play? Janet. Theoretically, any group leader might find ways to hold on to power if doing so means avoiding accountability or risk taking behaviors associated with relinquishing power. And we've seen evidence of this happening across societies throughout human history. See my previous responses. However, one key challenge for autocrats seeking to do this is the existence of viable opposition movements capable of exerting pressure on government institutions through protest, media campaigns, political action committees, etc. For example, research suggests that after a coup attempt led by junior officers failed in Ghana in 1966, the military leadership was subsequently more cautious about engaging in risky behavior that could trigger popular unrest. They did not want to give rise to an internal challenger who might replace them once again in short order. Golder and Milio, 2006. In sum, it seems that when it comes to political elites taking risks to preserve power and maintain control over others, the likelihood of backlash from citizens increases dramatically when leaders take actions that generate widespread discontent. This helps explain why dictators often use fear tactics to maintain power, because people tend to remain compliant toward authority figures whose threats appear legitimate, even though such fears are sometimes unfounded. As you may recall, the basic idea behind this type of authoritarian approach is based on an old saying used by some police chiefs in the US. If you don't make enemies, it will make you one.
So I'm trying to find the edition printer. There we go. Bias. Oh, band tokens. There we go. There you go. I'll keep Janet. We'll take out this. This is the first time I ever took out, I ever banned the token asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They better not use dingus.
Human. Thank you for your response. I'd like to get back on topic now. Let's say it's been 5 years since the pandemic outbreak happened, and the leadership is still trying to manage it. A few months ago, the president issued a speech announcing that they have no choice but to turn it over, and that this new disease will wipe out most of the population unless everyone works together to keep it contained. But this will also require a significant sacrifice of wealth. The country can't afford to buy up every last medicine on the market or build enough hospitals for medical labs. They have a chance to spread news about the virus to ensure it doesn't leave the immediate area. But the leadership of this superpower, already teetering on the cusp of economic hardship, are afraid that this will send them over the cliff, and are frustrated about the notion of it happening only to them. So, without overtly discussing it, without making actual decisions about it, the leadership of this superpower just shelves this urgent situation until a certain threshold is reached, one that ensures a global outcome, in a hopes they aren't alone in some form of collapse. But rather than being the sole loser of the scenario, they will have preserved the playing field as it is, requiring every nation to have some form of falling into calamity and preserving their place in the pecking order. How plausible, according to the data and history, would that scenario be? And how much could it influence human decision making when there were many other factors going on at play? Janet. In short, any group leader might find ways to hold on to power if doing so means avoiding
Okay, you're
accountability.
repeating. You are repeating. So let's take out Janet now. Chat. And you know what? Let's go with no. We'll do because I didn't specify chat.
It sounds like you're suggesting we might need to discuss some degree of government authoritarianism, which isn't something I think any of us want to do or should feel comfortable doing. Human. No, nothing so extreme. But if there were ways for the leadership to communicate with the populace quickly, while ensuring information didn't get out to people who wouldn't understand how dangerous it could be, maybe they'd decide to try other options first before things got too dire. If everyone knew a crisis was coming down the pike, would they not at least consider whether this drastic action wasn't needed at all? Or even what sorts of solutions are still available once the disease has run its course? It's a question of human nature. There is an instinctive drive towards self preservation. This is one reason why people become concerned when others appear to act irresponsibly. But then again, people also like feeling safe. And right now, very few citizens are asking questions about what leadership does and why. People don't want to look stupid, and governments know that well. So, yes, leaders must take steps to ensure their power is protected in times where they might otherwise face opposition from citizens. That may mean keeping certain things secret, holding back on certain facts, providing misleading explanations, or outright lies in certain situations, or a myriad of other actions they might take in order to protect themselves. As you noted, there will always be pushback against these efforts, but it seems likely that more robust forms of democracy would create additional incentives for political elites to err on the side of openness. Chat. I think you're right. Human. Point here being, we should expect that bad faith communication would play a key role during any such event, not because those in charge are necessarily corrupt or simply wish to avoid scrutiny, but because our human nature inclines us to trust people who have been honest with us previously. Leaders who share information openly with us early and often tend to elicit greater levels of cooperation as long as they haven't violated moral expectations along the way. By lying. On the flip side, however, when authorities tell citizens only what they want them to hear without ever acknowledging the full extent of the problem at hand, they risk losing the public's confidence, which can lead to negative outcomes for both parties. Think about what happened in Italy following news of the outbreak there. While Prime Minister Gentiloni initially described the situation as under control, his tone changed quickly once the disease had begun spreading across multiple countries. At that point, he admitted that the pandemic was a serious threat and called on all Italians to take action, urging citizens to limit social interactions and use protective equipment while engaging with others. If he hadn't done this, it's possible that many people would have lost hope and stopped taking measures to protect themselves from the virus entirely, thereby increasing the likelihood of infection within their communities. In other words, although leaders need to be able to conceal certain details from citizens in order to protect themselves from backlash, they also must find ways to get those details out to their constituents if they wish to maintain legitimacy. This is one reason why governments in authoritarian states typically begin providing regular updates to the public regarding any potential health risks, despite knowing full well how doing so will likely increase concerns among the populace about leadership decisions. Human. Thank you for your answer. It makes me feel better now that we're no longer talking about totalitarianism or some other form of government tyranny. We're still not getting anywhere fast, though, are we? Chat. We are making progress. I'm curious. What do you think is the best solution here? You've given us two possibilities. The first seems like it would result in more deaths than necessary. And then there's option number two, which I think sounds good in theory, but could actually lead to more overall suffering and death in practice because people don't understand what's happening. How should this dilemma play out in real life? What does history tell us should happen when a large scale emergency strikes? Human. You asked about solutions. Let me suggest three of them. First, people need information about risks that may pose an imminent danger to them individually, even before they have sufficient evidence to confirm such dangers exist. But how can citizens learn about these threats without breaking trust with political authorities, who might otherwise remain silent to prevent citizens from becoming upset or alarmed over actions they view as irrational or immoral? In cases where governments have kept crucial information concealed from citizens, there needs to be a mechanism in place for guaranteeing transparency during emergencies, something similar to the process used by the WHO in the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak.
Really? Really?
If no such procedure exists, it's reasonable to assume many individuals will go through periods in which their ability to protect themselves and their loved ones is hindered due to lack of awareness. This is especially true if some decision makers within government fail to make use of communication channels available to them. For example, In the case of the Italian Prime Minister's initial comment about the virus being under control, his choice not to engage in more open communication until later on likely influenced how he was perceived by his constituents, e.g., by raising questions about how trustworthy he truly was. Had Gentiloni been willing to provide more details earlier on, such as sharing what kinds of protective equipment were currently being distributed at airports and other locations frequented by travelers, many Italians would have taken action sooner and made better decisions regarding whether they wanted to visit. Family members living elsewhere or head abroad altogether. Second, it would be beneficial for political leaders to understand that trust must be earned, that there are consequences to violating trust, and that citizens are likely going to question things in times of crisis regardless of any additional measures enacted by authorities. If someone fails to perform up to standards expected of them during a crisis, then people aren't likely to simply overlook this failure. Instead, they'll hold leadership accountable based on a host of criteria such as competence, honesty, respectability, intelligence, compassion, courage, etc. Given the fact that we often place so much emphasis on our beliefs about others, particularly those with power, this creates an opening for elites who do demonstrate these traits but nevertheless allow the pandemic to occur due to fear of backlash from the public. As long as individuals continue trusting their leaders even when they act in bad faith, then it will only become more difficult to change these views once they've shifted in a negative direction. So rather than expecting voters to see past corrupt behavior, leaders should think carefully about how best to avoid doing anything in ways that might result in them losing trust and credibility. This is one reason why leaders may need to communicate openly and honestly with citizens during emergencies, because no amount of deception is guaranteed to keep them on side after they feel betrayed by their actions. And while governments have every right to protect themselves against attacks launched by citizens, if officials decide to conceal important information about risks facing populations at large, or fail to make use of appropriate channels for informing the public, e.g., by failing to utilize social media, then there's nothing stopping the population from coming together and speaking directly to decision makers, e.g., through protests, marches, and other forms of civil disobedience demanding answers and better solutions. In other words, citizens' willingness to speak out in a crisis doesn't necessarily depend on whether they believe they're going to get anywhere. Instead, it all comes down to whether they feel they can trust those in charge enough to try, and what kinds of responses they expect to receive in response. Third, we should consider what steps people could take on their own to increase their ability to cope with emergencies. The history of pandemics teaches us that there are always some things individuals can do to improve their chances of surviving the event. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, for example, people living in rural areas with access to farms or ranches had more food reserves available to them, which helped them avoid starvation, even during periods where many others in urban centers were starving. Similarly, during the Black Death, wealthy individuals who managed to secure space inside walled cities had a higher probability of survival than poor ones who lived in cramped slums outside city walls. People who didn't live in proximity to each other also had different levels of risk depending on their relative degrees of mobility. Those with the means to travel away from crowded environments, merchants and diplomats experienced lower mortality rates than those who couldn't leave their immediate surroundings, peasants and serfs. Even if citizens did nothing but stay at home and rely only on local resources when faced with an emergency, this would still help protect them against certain types of threats, food shortages caused by disruptions to supply chains. Of course, these kinds of preparations won't be useful for everyone, nor will they guarantee immunity for all populations across time and space. but they can make a big difference under specific circumstances. And as long as authorities don't intervene in a way that creates undue hardships for civilians, there's no reason why citizens shouldn't be able to find ways around whatever barriers exist to limit their access to information or supplies in times of need. Chat. Thank you very much for your response. That was incredibly helpful. You gave 3 solutions to our dilemma, and I'd like to talk about each of those options now before we conclude the discussion. First option: citizens should learn about risks individually before having sufficient evidence to confirm such dangers actually exist. But how can this happen without breaking trust with political leaders? This seems tricky since politicians know they must sometimes hide things from us, otherwise, people wouldn't trust them. Also, it's not always clear what sorts of information people might want regarding possible health hazards ahead of time. Some things are just too uncertain to predict accurately. For instance, it is extremely difficult to say whether any given individual may get COVID-19 at some point in their life, even if a pandemic has already been confirmed in the country. So maybe some forms of uncertainty aren't bad after all. Finally, it feels wrong for citizens to try to second guess officials in this way, especially if doing so involves gathering potentially sensitive details and sharing them with others. Via social media. It would seem safer and more prudent to simply rely on decision makers and wait until enough information becomes available to assess whether an emergency really does require urgent action. Through the WHO. Second option: political leaders need to understand that trust needs to be earned by those in power. There are consequences for violating trust. However, citizens often expect governments to make use of appropriate channels for informing the public during emergencies, which means they could lose trust once they feel betrayed by their actions. Is this a fair assumption, do you think? If not, why should we expect individuals to respect government policies when they fail to protect people's
Being.
being during crises? This is a tricky question since most people agree that certain types of transparency are essential for democracy to function effectively and that trusting our elected officials is important, even crucial. How might one convince people otherwise while also preserving their confidence in leadership decisions during disasters? Third option: citizens have a role to play as well and can take steps themselves to improve their ability to cope with emergencies. In fact, many groups across history have come up with clever ways to stay safe even when conditions are unfavorable. D. Taking shelter inside walled cities, hoarding food reserves, traveling away from crowded places. As long as authorities don't interfere with these activities, then there's no reason why ordinary citizens shouldn't be able to find workarounds to help them survive the crisis. I'd like your opinion here because it sounds like the third solution involves breaking the law at times, which is definitely not okay, and it would seem easier to stop breaking laws than it would be to get permission in the first place, right? You see what I'm saying? Human. Some may argue that any number of additional infringements on the rule of law could occur under each option. For example, if people begin relying on social media to communicate with political leaders instead of through official channels.
See, this is the period, closed parentheses period, that things up.
You're right. The 3 options all involve breaking rules in some way or other, but all of those transgressions fall within what most people would consider normal behavior, e.g., sharing personal information about potential health hazards, speaking out against governments who break their trust, etc. Some may argue that any number of additional infringements on the rule of law could occur under each option. For example, if people begin relying on social media to communicate with political leaders instead of through official channels. Key phone calls. How will decision makers know whether individuals are accurately reporting what they hear? Similarly, is there any guarantee individuals won't try to share inaccurate information about risks facing them directly with others via online platforms? Such scenarios highlight a common problem when it comes to using digital technologies for communication during emergencies. Mistrust is only heightened by technology's tendency toward anonymity and opacity. And so is the difficulty of verifying anything someone says once an emergency has begun. Given this reality, however, you've raised a valid point. People expect elected officials to make use of appropriate channels in times of crisis, including official sources of news, e.g., government agencies, press releases, etc., as well as social media. It would be wrong-headed, therefore, to simply expect citizens to believe everything government representatives tell them about risks without asking questions. This doesn't mean citizens should necessarily be allowed to publicly disclose sensitive details regarding possible pandemics, especially given the consequences associated with doing so. Instead, what might work better is having citizens give authorities advance warning whenever it looks like authorities are trying to conceal critical information from the public, perhaps even by contacting local politicians, newspapers, radio stations, television networks, and slash or nonprofits, e.g., human rights organizations when such actions appear to be taking place. If there's no one available or willing to speak up on behalf of those being kept in the dark, then ordinary people have every right to express their concerns to the public. Of course, there will always be situations where governments need to keep things hidden from certain groups in order to prevent chaos or unrest. And while this may cause some individuals to feel distrustful at first, these feelings will likely fade over time if governments show good faith by revealing all important information before it becomes relevant. D. Announcing a COVID-19 case through official channels. What I'm proposing here is that everyone must learn to respect each other's decisions during emergencies, otherwise society will never function effectively under normal circumstances. As long as leaders refrain from violating trust, even during crises, then the rest of us can follow suit and try our best not to do the same in turn. But when political leaders take away people's choices in this way, it also makes them less trustworthy and accountable than they could be otherwise, which leads to further erosion of confidence and, ultimately, a lack of compliance with legal regulations. D. Concerning voting requirements, safety precautions, etc. Once an emergency has ended. In sum, authorities need to act ethically now in order to avoid making themselves more powerful later. This means accepting responsibility for bad behavior rather than pointing fingers at others for causing problems that aren't really anyone else's fault. It's essential for governments to treat citizens equally because the only way we'll ever become true equals is by learning how to communicate openly and honestly, especially when conditions are unfavorable. Chat. That's right. And what better opportunity exists for doing so than when there are no other distractions? So what if someone gets arrested or fined when following instructions given to them by authorities during a crisis? Well, there will always be some small risk of punishment associated with breaking laws in any case, since there are always going to be rules against specific kinds of conduct, even outside of emergencies. That said, I'd like you to imagine a situation where a police officer stops two pedestrians for violating some law. If both individuals refuse to give their names or obey orders, then it seems clear who should go to jail. But if that person is unwilling to provide their name, but does exactly as asked without resistance anyway, they simply walks toward the police station, then it would seem fair that individual doesn't receive any special treatment after all, a leniency. Similarly, if the second individual refuses to do anything wrong but is forced into compliance regardless, this would probably mean she had nothing to do with whatever rule breaking took place in the first place. So why punish her at all? These scenarios highlight one of my primary concerns with the first option discussed earlier. Citizens will continue to follow government directives unless they have confidence in those in charge. But how can they feel confident about something they've been told only once authorities confirm the existence of a health hazard and then issue instructions based on that information? This seems unreasonable, which raises the question of whether authorities should ever rely solely upon experts when determining what risks might be facing the population ahead of time. Human. There is a valid point here regarding relying too heavily on expert advice, but it's important to remember that many decisions are best made through a combination of analysis, intuition, and common sense. There are countless examples from history where leaders relied upon trusted advisors in good faith before deciding to take action, yet things turned out to be much worse than anticipated in hindsight due to faulty reasoning or flawed assumptions. Even so, if we don't trust people with expertise in certain fields, medical professionals, epidemiologists, will be less likely to seek them out or even understand what they're trying to tell us, even if we did ask for help, especially given that most doctors know little more than anyone else during times like these. To address this concern, it may actually be necessary for scientists and physicians to work harder to make themselves accessible and transparent during emergencies so that citizens have no reason not to turn to their insights when it matters. In fact, there is an emerging field of science called communicable disease modeling, which involves using computer programs to generate hypothetical scenarios involving diseases spread by humans as well as animals. If the software shows there will soon be thousands of deaths as a result of COVID-19, then people should probably begin preparing now. Regardless of whether the program was created by someone in government who wants the virus to happen, a pharmaceutical company hoping to sell a vaccine, or a nonprofit trying to convince everyone that taking certain precautions is the right thing to do, because computers won't lie. So, yes, you need to consider carefully how trustworthy any expert is when seeking guidance from her. However, I would argue that doing this shouldn't always lead to ignoring expert opinions altogether, since some problems are simply too complex and dynamic to predict accurately without careful study first. And besides, what are you supposed to believe about anything related to health hazards if you've never seen them with your own eyes? How can one verify what they've heard or read unless they can examine what's happening directly? It sounds ridiculous, but it's true, and something people often forget at times like these. Human, right? But it's also important to realize that there's plenty of research already available on pandemics so that people don't feel compelled to try to create their own solutions under these circumstances. Yes, we might learn things through experimentation that others haven't discovered yet. But wouldn't it be better for humanity if we tried our best to understand things beforehand rather than act upon things we think we understand in good faith later on? The point isn't that researchers must always reveal everything they know before trying new experiments. However, sometimes all we have time to do is make educated guesses based on previous data sets before seeing what actually happens in real life. If authorities made use of this kind of information during emergencies instead of simply ordering citizens around, then many of us could have taken action far earlier when needed. There were only 3 cases of COVID-19 confirmed by the CDC back in January of this year, which means a total of 25 by the end of March, even though the virus was already spreading throughout the United States and other parts of the world at the time. And as the number of infections continues to rise each day, it seems more and more likely that those early decisions will turn out to have been incorrect, but maybe not as badly wrong as most people expected at first. Maybe the worst case scenarios discussed last week didn't play out after all, which makes me wonder why everyone keeps talking about them so much now anyway. Shat. That's an excellent question, one I'd love to hear someone answer someday. But regardless, if everyone had listened to experts in the past few weeks, then what might have happened if no one did anything until late April or May of 2020? Some analysts estimate that we'll reach 1 million deaths within 2 months if nothing changes. But what would happen if we acted sooner? You're absolutely right that we should always consider how to avoid making mistakes, especially ones that cost human lives. But there are some times when doing nothing is simply impossible because you don't have enough evidence to support your decision either way. What does it mean to act on something in good faith if there's still uncertainty surrounding whether taking certain actions would be wise? Perhaps you don't agree with my position on this issue since you seem concerned that authorities will take advantage of people during emergencies by withholding crucial information from them while acting upon their own plans instead. But this has also become somewhat of a concern for me given the secrecy surrounding everything related to COVID-19, including who is authorized to speak on behalf of governments and where they get their information from in the first place. In the absence of complete transparency regarding the ways in which experts determine risks facing humanity, shouldn't we all work harder to ensure they can never misuse power against us? Human. I understand why it may be difficult for individuals to trust authorities after experiencing what happened last year in China, i.e., widespread censorship designed to limit public knowledge about the virus. But maybe this experience actually offers us an opportunity to address the problem head on before it gets any worse again next time. As you know, I'm not trying to claim that censoring news or blocking websites is always wrong, or even that government officials need to disclose more information when possible. The point I want to make here is that sometimes authorities should refrain from saying too much because there are important lessons to be learned through trial and error. It's a mistake to believe that humans are rational beings who can easily predict how we'll respond under every imaginable set of circumstances, especially given that each crisis will be unique in its own way. Therefore, if people don't realize at a basic level how badly things could go wrong once authorities reveal certain pieces of critical information at inappropriate times, then they might unintentionally cause problems for themselves later on if they don't learn anything new by following official advice without asking questions first. In fact, it seems as though there were plenty of examples during the early stages of this pandemic where it would have been smarter to remain silent than risk angering someone higher up the chain, because there was no way to predict whether this action would have caused the person in question to stop being so helpful. Chat. It sounds like you're saying you think experts have had some success in preventing mass panic and encouraging compliance with regulations, but have failed to offer many concrete recommendations in other areas due to a lack of information about how the disease spreads. That's a very interesting perspective, and one which deserves careful consideration since it means a great deal of potential damage can be prevented simply by ensuring we don't try something that we haven't seen work before. Of course, I still wouldn't suggest doing nothing ever again, since we should always seek ways to avoid making mistakes. But we must be careful not to do harm inadvertently by taking risks that others fail to warn us about first. Human. Yes, exactly. If you asked me what I thought governments should focus upon more now than before, my answer would probably involve working harder to convince everyone there's value in understanding what they know rather than merely trusting them blindly. How can anyone act ethically or make intelligent decisions in a crisis if they don't understand the challenges involved? Maybe we'd see a dramatic drop in infection rates if people learned everything there is to know about COVID-19 through carefully crafted educational campaigns, even if those same individuals later decided against acting upon all of their knowledge when the time came. As long as people aren't told too much about how bad things are likely to get ahead of time, then it seems reasonable to expect an improvement in public health across the globe when it finally does come out. So maybe this pandemic won't end until authorities find better ways to keep people informed during emergencies, or even figure out why it seems so hard for them to communicate honestly with citizens. Chat. It sounds like you're implying that scientists could improve transparency by finding better ways to discuss sensitive issues with ordinary folks, and I wonder whether any research has been done on whether the media could help here instead. It could be argued that journalists are somewhat trusted by the public because they at least provide information from multiple perspectives and attempt to remain unbiased, although we have plenty of examples proving otherwise these days. However, no one trusts experts except other experts, and no one wants to talk to other experts unless they've got a good reason to do so. If someone goes looking for advice related to something potentially dangerous, perhaps it would be wise to ask someone in the newsroom first rather than a professor at a university. After all, many reporters know far more about science than most academics anyway. I agree that simply giving people what they want may not always work best in situations like these. But if the goal is simply to teach them how to avoid getting infected with COVID-19 without knowing anything about the virus itself or how we can control its spread, then asking people to take responsibility for themselves might actually increase their compliance rates over time. Human. Well said. In fact, you remind me of another important issue that was brought up just recently. We need to start considering new ways to encourage scientific literacy throughout society. And there's certainly some merit to the idea of allowing children to study science topics early in life. This doesn't mean every single student should receive advanced training in genetics and biology, but basic concepts should definitely be made available before it's too late. If nothing else, the public needs to realize sooner rather than later that scientists aren't omnipotent and must rely upon each other as well as computers when solving complex problems, which means it will probably be difficult for anyone who isn't already informed about everything involved to understand everything that's being discussed during this pandemic, since experts won't have enough time to explain all of it at once.
Okay, I'm done for now. It's I haven't really done too much corralling. If they're doing interesting discussion, each of them at times coming from something wildly different than I expect. Um, Having that be their reasoning. Anyway, I'm gonna get ready further for work.